Enormous changes are sweeping across the Muslim world. There are cultural and social changes that one could not have imagined just a few years ago. I'm going to talk about this with James Dorsey, who is an award winning journalist and who spent his life looking at the Middle East and looking at various Muslim countries. He's a journalist, he's also at the Singapore Technical University, and he writes prolifically. James, thanks very much for having a conversation on this.
Pervis, it's a joy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
James, I want to ask about modernization in the Muslim world, but I have to first disaggregate modernization and tell you what I mean by it so that I can ask you specific questions regarding that. So let me separate it into three parts. First would be the cultural and the social system, those norms which characterized Muslim society, which was essentially very conservative. um, that is a point where a departure was needed. There was there was within that system very severe restrictions placed on what women could do or not do. The family system was very tight, and there were social mores regarding sexuality and many other general assumptions. And now that appears to be relaxing. For example, we see now that women are being allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, that in the UAE, couples can live together without being married. There's also the question of alcohol consumption, and that was a huge taboo in UAE, and I think earlier on in Turkey as well. But now all those things have gotten relaxed. So that's one aspect, the cultural and the social of modernization. But there's also the political aspect. The political systems in Muslim countries, very few of them had been democratic. And if one talked about democracy, the examples that would come to one's mind would be perhaps Malaysia or Morocco, although there's a kingship over there. But in terms of a liberal political system, one which was participatory, that, of course, the absence of that led to the Arab Spring. So I want you to consider that as well. And finally, in terms of modernization, there is the education system, the epistemology, the knowledge system by which people understand the world around them. So, on these three basic sets of assumptions, I want you to examine various countries, starting with, let's say, Saudi Arabia. There's been an enormous change over there. Why did this change? First of all, what is this change? Do you perceive it as being genuine? And how far is it going to go? And what caused it?
Okay, before I go into that, let me make an overall remark in terms of what you just said. Uh, I think what we're dealing with, dealing with a multitude of countries that all happen to be Muslim majority, but are very different countries. And a lot of what the restrictions that one sees on various social groups, whether that's women, whether that's issues related to gender identity, whether that's religious or ethnic minorities, may not have anything to do with religion and everything to do with culture and often autocratic rule. So the Saudi crown prince privately, uh, before he lifted the ban on women's driving, said in a private meeting to justify lifting the ban, women rode camels in the time of the Prophet. Why can't they drive cars today? So, with other words, this was not a religious ban. It had nothing to do with Islam as such, even if the packaging of the justification was a religious one. So, what's driving the change, and what we're seeing primarily is social change and to a degree, upgrading of education systems. We are not seeing political change. If anything, we've seen certainly in the Gulf and the Middle East, but also elsewhere. Pakistan is an example. Bangladesh is another example. We've seen a retrograde movement away from whatever limited freedoms there were to a more repressive, more brutal
Yeah,
often
but before we go into that,
regime.
tell us.
Hold on, but let me just finish if I may. Let me just finish if I may. What's changing? So what's driving these social changes is one. It's I think three things. First of all, youth aspirations. A lot of these countries, including Saudi Arabia, are countries with youth bulges. A majority of their populations are under 30. And one thing that Mohammed bin Salman has going for him, he understands that generation intuitively because he's part of it. And he also can communicate with that generation in ways that his octogenarian father cannot. And so, if you want to ensure that your regime survives, to some degree, it has to be able to cater to aspirations. Second of all, these are certainly the resource rich economies. So, the oil and gas rich economies of the Gulf, for example, uh, they no longer can rely on a rentier economy, essentially. They need to diversify their economies. If you want to diversify your economy, you can't have half of your population, namely women, excluded from the labor market. You have to include them. Economic diversification also means restructuring of the economy in the sense that the private sector starts to play a much greater role, and the public sector that in some of the Gulf countries employs 70 to 80% of the labor force. That's no longer sustainable. And the third driver of this is the world we live in. We live in a world in which you need to project yourself as a country. You need to project an image of being forward looking, of being able to embrace technological change. That's not a world in women being not allowed to drive would fare very well. So I think those are the three drivers of
Okay,
this.
that actually makes a lot of sense because if you want to be part of the normal world, then you have to behave like the normal world. But why is this happening now? You said it's because of one individual, Mohammed bin Salman. If it had been a different crown prince, it would have gone a different way, perhaps. Is there something very unique about this person? Or is this a larger feeling among the royal family of Saudi Arabia that they have to now break with tradition? Earlier on, it had been a
Look,
very strictly traditional society. And within that society, I'm sure there are diverse ways of thinking.
it's not a question of one man. In fact, a number of these reforms were started, or in any case, were being discussed already under King Abdullah. And even in the period in which King Abdullah was crown prince, de facto ruler, but not yet king. So it's not like Mohammed bin Salman is the best thing since sliced bread and has had this grand vision. It's something that's been discussed and been realized. Why it's happening now? I think, first of all, because of the 2011 popular Arab revolts that uh, that just demonstrated the degree of discontent, the depth of the grievances that are across the Middle East. Two, again, you know, we live in a dynamic world. We don't live in a static world. What was acceptable autocracy half a century ago or 30, 40 years ago is no longer possible. Autocrats who want to remain in power need to upgrade their autocracy in various ways, and that's what they're doing. And the third reason is, of course, economic. This was no longer sustainable, particularly not in a world in which climate change, green economy, moving away from fossil fuels, has become a main economic driver. So that's why I think this is
To
happening
your
now.
knowledge, has Saudi Arabia firmly moved away from its earlier policy of funding madrasas, of promoting Wahhabi Islam? Because earlier on, if you look across the globe, you saw mosques being built with a very particular kind of ideology, the Wahhabi ideology. We saw after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 a huge proliferation of Saudi funded madrasas in Pakistan. And in fact, the principal funders of the jihad, of the first international jihad of history, were the Saudis. Do you see a firm and a total move away from that? And even if it is at the government level, is it also true at the level of rich princes and sheikhs who feel that they have a religious obligation to spread Wahhabi ideology across the world?
Well, I think first of all, uh, yes, there has been a, a radical cutback in funding of religious activity overseas. Not absolute, so you still see it in places like Indonesia, but there has been a radical cutback. Now, having said that, first of all, whatever reforms Mohammed bin Salman has introduced, one reform he has not introduced, and that's religious reform. He has talked about going back to what he claims Islam was in Saudi Arabia. He has, but there has been no reform of Islamic jurisprudence. And as long as you do not undertake that, there is no reform of the religion. So the social changes that have been made in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates also, in Qatar and various other places, are just what what they are, social changes. They are not anchored. They are not anchored in religious law. Uh, but in terms of attitudes towards the Saudi interpretation of Islam, they've first of all, okay, if you look at the Saudi funding campaign, it was with Pakistani help. Go back to Maududi. The institutions, some of the institutions of that uh, uh, Saudi funding campaign, $100 billion over 40 years, the single largest public diplomacy campaign in history. Uh, so some of those institutions, whether it's the Islamic University of Medina or the Rabita, the Muslim World League, were conceived of by Maududi, who sat on their boards. Then you got in 1979 the the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the occupation of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. And so a majority of the ruling family saw funding Wahhabism globally, not so much as a religious task, but as a political task, because the core of what they wanted was anti Shia and anti Iran. That's not to say that that's not to say that some princes are deeply religious and favored this, but that's basically what it was. Um, and so, in terms of the residue of that, there is a segment of Saudi population, including of the Saudi elite, without question, I probably a minority, but how big a minority, nobody knows, that has problems with the changes, social changes that have been enacted, but obviously have no opportunity to
James, this
voice
seems
that.
to me very dangerous that if you do not radically reinterpret Islamic theology, then it appears that you are going against Islam. And to a population that's been brought up on the notion of Islam as being the best religion in the world and of every word of it being correct and being the word of God itself, then if you start violating that, it's very, very dangerous. There's another way, and that is of seeking liberal interpretations of Islam. And we've had examples of that, like Rashid Rida and Sayyid Ahmad Khan on the Indian subcontinent, who sought to who sought to interpret Islam in a more liberal way. So, for example, you have arguments against polygamy, arguments against slavery, arguments for the equality of men, arguments for allowing banks. Now, Maududi used to say, in fact, it's in his books, that riba, sood, interest, bank interest, that is the most heinous of crimes. And as you said, he had enormous influence in Saudi Arabia. But of course, he was overruled because you can't make banks function. If you can't make banks function, then you can't then have all the goodies that oil brings you. Are you saying that within Saudi Arabia there are no voices calling for a similar reinterpretation of Islam? So, for example, look, in Pakistan, you would have Javed Ghamidi, who would be arguing for a very different kind of Islam from the Hanafi Islam of Maududi. Of course, it's not easy for him, that's why he doesn't live over here, but there is a voice over there. Are there no such voices in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, let's divide issues. First of all, of course, there are voices in Saudi Arabia. The problem is they're either in prison or they make sure that they do not voice whatever their views are because they would be in prison. So that's, so it's not that there are no voices, it's that voices are silenced, and they're silenced absolutely. But there's some more fundamental issues here. Uh, I I deliberately don't use the word liberal, uh, but there are the question. First of all, uh, with regard to Saudi Arabia, yes, you have, as I said before, a segment which is ultra conservative, grew up in this ultra conservative society, and therefore, to whom this change is haram. It's sin. But you have uh, a major segment of the population, youth, many youth, whose attitude towards religion and towards religiosity, and as a result towards authority, has changed. So they no longer want a ritualized experience of their religion, one in which you're held to uh, public behavior. Uh, they want a much more individual experience of it. And it's a trend that you see in other Muslim countries. They also no longer uh, necessarily accept authority, whether secular, temporal, or religious, by definition. They question it, and so the with other words, the change is much more, in that sense, uh, much more in society, and not necessarily then expressed in political terms and legal terms, but it's real. The other issue is when we're talking about uh, reform of the religion. So we're talking Islam. like Judaism, as opposed to Christianity, is a religion that is governed by law. And you obviously cannot change the Quran because it's the word of God, but there's a lot of other stuff you can change. And there's the jurisprudence that you can change. So there are multiple issues here. There's the issue of the kafir. There's the issue of the dhimmis. There's the issue of apostasy.
which is punishable by death.
So there are multiple issues here. There's the issue of the kafir. Now, to give you an example, the only movement outside of the Middle East that can actually challenge these things as a movement is Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia. First of all, it's the world's single largest Muslim movement with about 90 million followers. And like Arab Islam and much of Islam has Al Azhar and other the Islamic University of Medina, other institutions of religious authority. Nahdlatul Ulama has those, and so it actually started the process of jurisprudential change. So in 2019, you had 20,000 uh, ulama who got together and they issued a fatwa eradicating the category of a kafir.
Yeah.
But there are multiple other issues which you have to deal with, which include the dhimmis, include apostasy, include blasphemy, um, and none of that has been addressed yet. Certainly not in. And you have the issue that what is being called moderate Islam is autocratic in nature for two reasons. One is it adheres to the concept of absolute obedience to the ruler and preaches that rather than you know the right to resist and so on. And it uses the concept of tolerance, religious tolerance, implied in the relationship. Implied in tolerance is a relationship of unequal power. I tolerate you. It does not imply and again, Indonesia is different here. It does not imply the notion uh, of multiculturalism, of equality before the law, irrespective of creed, ethnic identity, religious identity. Uh, so what we are seeing in terms of what is being defined as Muslim moderation, one is questionable whether it's religious moderation or actually secular moderation,
Yeah,
and
and there's the big
whether or not it
question of
is
whether
moderate
Islam can accommodate a
in the
pluralist
W.
society. There are people who say that if you look back into the past, into the history of Spain, you see that Muslims and Jews live together. Muslims, Jews, and Christians live together. Well, they did under Muslim rule, but then the Jews and the Christians didn't have the same rights as the Muslims. But coming back to Saudi Arabia, just briefly, I want to move away from that though. Surely in Saudi Arabia, if you were just accused, mind you, of tearing out pages of the Quran, would you be lynched by a mob and set alight, as have as is the case very recently? Would that happen in Saudi Arabia, once upon a time the most conservative of countries?
Look, I think that uh, you know, in terms of the extremity of response to perceived blasphemy and abuse of a draconic law that is at the root of a lot of problems, Pakistan is an extreme. It's in a class of its own. Uh, no, you wouldn't see that in Saudi Arabia. But having said that, Saudi Arabia's definition of terrorism includes atheism. So Rauf Badawi who may or may not come out of prison after a number of years and lashings later this month, was basically declared a terrorist because
Well, how does that
he's
constitute
essentially defined
terrorism?
himself as an atheist.
What makes that someone? How?
But no, no. But my point is, yes, you don't. Saudi Arabia is a lot better in the sense that you don't get the lynchings,
Okay,
but
let's move away from Saudi
that doesn't make
Arabia
it good.
and move to Iran, which is now perceived. They perceive each other as their mortal enemy. Is that characterization correct? Do you think?
Iran, for good or for bad, constitutes an alternative form of Islamic governance. For Saudi Arabia, that for the longest period of time defined itself, its identity was religious rather than national. That's starting to change, but nonetheless, this was a mortal threat. On top of that, we spoke about the revolts in 2011. There were two truly popular revolutions in the 20th century, the Russian one and the Iranian one. That is a fundamental threat to Saudi Arabia. But there's also another thing. When all is done and dusted, there are three and a half hegemons in the Middle East.
It's Israel.
Only one of them is Arab, and it's not Saudi Arabia. It's Egypt. No, Israel was my half. It's Egypt, it's Iran, and it's Turkey. These are all countries with for the Middle East huge population bases, somewhere between 80 and 100 million people. These are all countries that were former empires or have a long thousands of years of identity, deep-seated identity. They all have diversified economies. They're industrial bases. They have uh, highly educated youth. They have battle-hardened militaries. Saudi Arabia can't compete. Mecca and Medina is not going to do it. And sure, it'll be a diversified economy and it'll have a lot of cash if it manages things well because of the oil revenues and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it misses a lot of these assets. I mean, look at the Yemen war. They can buy whatever they want in terms of military equipment. They can't target. Uh, yeah. So I think now does that in a lot of ways when Barack Obama, much to the Saudi chagrin, said that Saudi Arabia and Iran have to learn to share the Middle East, he was absolutely right. Uh, you know, the fact that there are fundamental differences does not mean that you cannot find ways to coexist. But I think that both the Saudis are not unjustified in their perception of Iran as a threat, as much as Iran is not unjustified uh, in seeing Saudi Arabia as part of a larger threat
Now, the
to
drums
its
of
national
war are
security.
beginning to beat again in the Middle East with the anticipated failure of the nuclear accord, which Donald Trump arbitrarily pulled out of the JCPOA. Are you hearing those drums beating as I seem to from my Iranian colleagues?
I think it's getting less. So, with other words, one, I think it's too early to have a verdict on what's going to happen in Vienna. It could go either way, and we could get a deal, and we may not get a deal. Whichever the case is, the a key player in terms of a military strike, even if the 2015 international agreement is revived, or a military strike because it failed, are the Israelis. And I think that the Israelis, of course, they continue to maintain that the military option remains on the table. They've put $1.5 billion and probably will put more into preparing for a military strike. They're putting a lot of money into uh, a next generation laser driven anti defense missiles, anti missile defense system. But they're also starting to realize that one, the this is not Osirak Iraq 1981. This, the Iranian program is too diversified geographically, too well fortified in many ways in underground facilities and whatever. And at best, they would delay the program for a couple of years, and that's it. And so they're starting, and certainly in the case of a agreement in Vienna, they would get the international community, including the United States, against it if they were to bomb. So what you're seeing, let me just so what you're seeing now is the stepping up of, if you wish, unconventional warfare. So cyber attacks on gas stations, cyber attacks on all kinds of facilities, uh, in a bid uh, to foster, or not foster, to
Yeah, well, it
enhance
started with
already existing
Stuxnet,
public
and then
discussion.
it went on from there, and then there's the Iranian retaliation and so forth. But since we have only a little bit of time left, I want to come back to modernization. And one important part of that is knowledge, epistemology, the the acceptance of rationality, and all this is communicated through the education system. Now, Iran is head and shoulders above, I'd say, any other Muslim country, except perhaps for Turkey, in terms of the quality of its universities, in terms of the quality of its math and physics, which I am familiar with to an extent. Um, and yet, of course, its political system is mired back in the past. How do you see the education system in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Turkey now also changing in the last? How has it changed in the last couple of decades or so? Or if you want to go back further than that, I can tell you for sure that that in Pakistan, which was at one time a fairly liberal one, was put back enormously by General Ziaul Haq, and then it remained at a static level, and now it's being pushed to a new level by Imran Khan. But that's for later discussions at some other time. Tell me, how do you see the education systems now in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey? I don't. On Iran, I've told you that my little understanding of it, I've looked at the books, I've looked at the textbooks in Iran, and they are actually pretty good. They don't contain that kind of hate material that you have in Pakistani books. How is it now with Saudi Arabia and the others?
Okay. First of all, what you've seen in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates is the import of foreign universities. So Georgetown, Northwestern, New York University. Uh, those are all universities with significant campuses and a slightly a greater degree of freedom of expression within the classroom and the campus. So a lot of these, young Qataris, and a lot of them women, and young Emiratis are getting a high class Western education, and they're getting it at home at a time at which travel and so on is much more difficult. Saudi Arabia hasn't done that yet, but then again, you had the King Abdullah King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which was established under King Abdullah, in which gender segregation was lifted, and this is before Mohammed bin Salman, and which it was all about all about enhanced and improved education and preparing students for an advanced labor market. What we've seen in terms, I mean, what you were referring to, the issue with hate speech, prejudice, bias, whatever, was not so much in university exams. It was in, or in university textbooks. It was in pre-university, secondary, first primary and secondary school textbooks. And there, again, as part of the projection of the country, you've seen a great deal of improvement. Certainly in the uh, United Arab Emirates. Uh, Saudi Arabia has been under great pressure for the last 2 decades since 9/11, but finally in the last year or two has started to improve significantly. Now, Turkey's a totally different story. So Turkey's gone the other way. Since the crackdown in 2016, you've basically had government takeover. You've had a tremendous brain drain. Thousands of people are in prison. And so the quality of the education may be there, but uh, a lot of the brains are either in prison or they're overseas. And that hurts the system, of course.
Okay, my last question. We know the dark spots of the Muslim world. There is Afghanistan, which is the darkest of them all. There is Pakistan, which under Imran Khan has regressed enormously in terms of the education. Where are the bright spots? Where do you see them in the Muslim world? And what's the thinking behind
To
that?
me, the major to me the major bright spot is Indonesia. Now, you will hear a lot of criticism from Indonesia. There are conservative societal forces. There are incidents, whether it's attacks on Shiites, attacks on Ahmadis, whatever it may be. But you have a legal structure that does declare equality before the law. So, to give you an example, the Minister of Religious Affairs, who again is a member of Nahdlatul Ulama, uh, he's the brother of the current Nahdlatul Ulama leader, but nonetheless, he several months ago greeted the Baha'is on their religious holiday, which whatever it was, and he was taken to task for that on the grounds that one, the Baha'is are not a recognized religion in Indonesia, and two, they're considered heretics by many Muslims. And his answer was, "Of course, I congratulated them. They are Indonesian citizens and equal before the law. Period." Um, you know, you have, and now Nahdlatul Ulama. Uh, Let me take one step. Nahdlatul Ulama was founded almost 100 years ago, 1926. It was founded for two reasons. One, it was anti-Wahhabi, and with the demise of the Ottoman Caliphate, it felt that there needed to be some, not a caliph necessarily, but a movement that sort of tried to unify, and that's what they took among them upon themselves. Uh, they now have a leader who is one of the fathers of what is called humanitarian Islam. And to give you one example, I know you want to end this, but to give you one example, what the world calls moderates, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, refuse to recognize Articles 18 and 19, which involve freedom of religion in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Recognition of that declaration, unconditional, with no exceptions, is written into Nahdlatul Ulama's DNA.
I guess that is possible because the history of Islam in Indonesia is very different from that of, let's say, South Asia, the entire India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because
Sure.
Islam came to Indonesia via traders. It didn't come via conquerors. I think that made a huge difference in terms of multiculturalism and the creation of a pluralist society there.
And and
Yes.
again, Javanese culture.
Tunisia, the brightest spot. Tell us something about that.
Not a bright spot at the moment. But having said that, I mean, I think it's encouraging that you're seeing today the demonstrations against the president's attempt to abolish the Supreme Judicial Council. Look, I think I think you need to take a step back. Everybody talks about 2011 as the Arab Winter rather than the Arab Spring. First of all, it wasn't the winter. If you look at the last decade, it wasn't four countries, it was eight countries in which governments were toppled by mass protest. So Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen in 2011, 2012, Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq in 2019 and 2020. These are processes that take anywhere from 25 to 50 years. We're at the beginning. We're not at the end. And it's maybe two steps forward, one step backwards. And of course, you have a brutal counter revolutionary movement with the resources to fund and manage the counter revolution in the Saudis and the Emiratis. But ultimately, this is still an ongoing process. And I would put it in an even larger context, and that is that we globally live in an era of defiance and dissent that goes all the way from Santiago de Chile via Wall Street to Tokyo and everything in between. We just
Let's
saw
hope that we
Kazakhstan.
are let's hope that we are there for the universalization of human values. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights becomes what every country in the world subscribes to. James, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Learned a lot.
Been my
Thank you
pleasure.
very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.